right. Well, welcome to the first Sealaska Heritage Institute Native American Month lecture. Today we're very fortunate. We have Byron Mallott with us, and Byron is going to be talking about ANCSA, good or bad. And I know there's been a lot of controversy about ANCSA, a lot of tensions around ANCSA, but there's also been a lot of good things. But before we do that, what I would like to do is call on John Moeller. John Moeller works for the governor. He's his special staff assistant on rural affairs and native affairs. And he will open up the lecture series with a proclamation from the governor. John Moeller.
Thank you so much, Rosita. It's such a pleasure to be here, Jelly, to speak just shortly, but mostly read the governor's proclamation here recently. And whoever loaned me their glasses this morning, I really appreciate it. I know they're just a tad bit girly, but I can deal with that. Thank you, Nancy. So here's an executive proclamation by Governor Sean Parnell. Just a little strong, Nancy. Whereas the state of Alaska honors and recognizes the first people of our state and nation, and whereas Alaska is a culturally diverse state with many indigenous cultures, including the Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, and Eyak cultures of Southeast, the Athabascan cultures of South Central and Interior Alaska, the Yupik, Chupik, Siberian Yupik, and Inupiaq cultures of Western and Northern Alaska, and the Aleut, Alutiiq, and Chugiak culture of Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, and Prince William Sound. And whereas each of these first peoples have a unique history, culture, and tradition, by teaching the next generation to practice and respect their cultural and spiritual heritage, indigenous language, oral narratives, and traditional foods, we build cultural community and nurture and inspire youth to engage with and appreciate their heritage. And whereas the wealth of knowledge and tradition that has been passed from generation to generation to our Alaska Native families, providing immeasurable value to our state and greatly enriches our communities. And whereas Alaska Native people play a vital role in the economic destiny of Alaska, serve in the United States Armed Forces, and the delivery of vital social service programs, contribute to the art and library endeavors of the state, and practice culturally relevant harvesting of food from Alaska's lands and waters. And whereas it is crucial that these rich cultures continue to thrive for future generations, and that the historical values continue to grow through the practicing of time-honored ceremonies, subsistence lifestyles, and traditional languages. Now therefore, I, Sean Parnell, Governor of the State of Alaska, do by proclaim November 2011 as Alaska Native Heritage Month.
Thank you very much, John, for a wonderful proclamation opening up Native American Heritage Month, and we will make sure that we keep this in our archives, our archivist. I should note that we are being broadcast webcast, so it's our lecture, or Byron's lecture, will be viewed across the state, and we hope to our people who are living outside of the state, and we know we have a lot of interested people who are interested in ANCSA who will also be tuning in. I would like to announce and recognize our main sponsor. Our main sponsor for the lecture series is MRV Architects. And our friends of the lecture series include the McDowell Group and also Kathy Ruddy. So we want to acknowledge them and thank them for their support. It is my pleasure to introduce someone who has been involved with ANCSA from its inception. I know many of you know him. He's played a very prominent role not only in Sealaska, in the growth and development of Sealaska, but also in the state as well, serving as the Commissioner of the Department of Rural Affairs, He served as the CEO of our very famous and well-loved permanent farm, made us a lot of money there. But a lot of people don't know his traditional role. Byron is the clan leader, the Chadehani of the Kwashikwan from the Yakutat. And I was very privileged to be at the ceremony where he was given this title and also given his ceremonial name. And his ceremonial name is, I think, very appropriate for him. It goes back to their actual migration into the Yakutat area. And it means it was the individual who was leading his group, his people, into the Yakutat area. But as I recall, the explanation of it when he received it was that not only did his ancestor lead his people into this new land, but also we felt that he was leading us into this new era, into the new 21st century. So it is my privilege and honor to introduce to you Byron Mallott. I'm sorry I can't pronounce his contact name because it has that hardly vocalized A right at the end, and I can't do it, but maybe Byron will do it.
I don't think I have to use it. I don't think so.
Does he need to use this?
Okay. Thank you, Rosita. Thank you all for being here. Many, many friends and people I work with and people that I don't know, but thank you for your interest. My clan name is Kudech Tom, as Rosita mentioned, and my responsibilities as clan leader I take very, very seriously. My other role here is as coffee maker. You may have seen me back here. So there is fresh coffee if anybody would like some. Maybe it's the title that I gave Rosita, Angsa, good or bad. Seems these days that everything is edged with a little bit of provocation in order to get people's attention. That's very much the case in the media. A more appropriate title might have been, maybe should have been, Angsa Good and Bad. Some would have, I think, liked the title to maybe be Angsa Good. Some may have suggested, if I'd had the opportunity to have a conversation with him or her, Angsa Bad. But there's no question that Angsa has affected our lives here in Alaska and the lives of Native people who are enrolled to the various corporations, both village and regional, and Angsa has certainly affected significantly the economic life of our state. I'd like to give just a few minutes of my perceptions of what Alaska was in the days of Angsa's being brought into reality. That is, essentially from the time of statehood, at least that era. Now, I must be quick to state that land claims and the efforts of Alaska's Native peoples to retain their lands, the use and occupancy, the stewardship of their lands began at the point of first contact with non-natives who came in increasing numbers into our state. And there were efforts almost immediately as the notion of land as property as opposed to a part of our being with spiritual values that nurtured, succored, created opportunity for future life for us, and which we didn't necessarily own but had stewardship of. And the notion of property was introduced, the notion of individual as opposed to communal rights and obligations was introduced. Obviously, the economic, social, and legal might of the United States ultimately, after Russia and several other nations had their incursions into Alaska, were all formidable and transformational in the lives of Alaska's Native peoples. And Native peoples began pushing back immediately that those events began to transpire. And we can't forget that. As is often said, people stand on the shoulders of others, and that was certainly the case in ANCSA. But that period of time, from statehood through the 60s and into the early 1970s, was, in my judgment, a very unique time in Alaska history. First of all, there was statehood itself. ANCSA was passed hardly a decade. December 1971, Alaska became a state, at least functionally, in 1959 and 1960. Many of you know, if not all of you, that the new state of Alaska was authorized in the Statehood Act by the federal government to select into its ownership up to 103 plus million acres of land in Alaska. Prior to statehood, virtually all land in Alaska belonged to the federal government, or in our instance, belonged to us. In our sense, belonged to us again in the sense of a spiritual connection and a stewardship of land, but with a deep, pervasive, abiding belief that these lands were ours in the sense that I've just described, with the traditions, the culture, the religion, the dance, everything that reflected and made up our lives was alive and real in the land. And all of the attributes of the land and those other living things of the land. And when I say land, of course, I also include waters, because here in Southeast and in the coastal areas of our state, and even on the river systems, obviously, the sense and the obligations and the responsibility of stewardship included that incredibly large and rich dimension. Alaska began immediately to select its lands, beginning literally the day that the statehood authorized the state of Alaska to come into existence and begin its life. In the 1950s, oil had been discovered and was even in production on the Kenai Peninsula. There was active oil exploration across the entire state. I remember as a young boy in my home of Yakutat, a company called the Colorado Oil and Gas Exploration Company, coming into the Yakutat forelands and building roads and airstrips and cat trails and having camps throughout the range of Yakutat lands and actively engaged in trying to find oil. A quick side story, not necessarily side story, it's germane, I think, and it's part of our history, but it's little known. The oil industry was aware that there were legal rights to land, undefined and untested, in Alaska by Alaska's Native peoples. And when the oil companies came to Yakutat, they entered into an agreement with the 5 clans in the Yakutat area to allow them to explore. The Yakutat clans did not give up any rights to land, did not give up any kind of ownership, and the oil interests involved, and you can imagine even then there were a lot of lawyers involved. The oil companies did not in any written form acknowledge in a legal sense that the native people of Yakutat could hinder or even necessarily approve of their rights to go on the land and seek oil. I mentioned that the 5 clans in Yakutat signed this document which said, okay, since you asked, go ahead and look for oil on our lands, but we aren't giving up anything that we may have by way of rights in your doing so. That became important to me, at least personally, in 1966 when we were forming the Alaska Federation of Natives in a meeting in Anchorage, and the meeting called by Imolnati and several other leaders was held in this building upstairs in downtown Anchorage, and I was there. I think there may have been a good 100 of us in the room. It was during the election cycle, and one of the rules to be able to stay in the room and form AFN was that obviously you had to be a native, but you also had to represent a native interest, an organization, an institution. And I was a young fellow. I was working in the governor's office at the time, not a high-powered special assistant as Mr. Moeller is, but a peon, but full of myself as the native leaders around the room were introducing themselves and their affiliation with various native institutions. I said, I'm Byron Mallott, and I represent Governor Egan of the state of Alaska. And they said, throw the bum out! And I had to leave. And that very day, telephone access was very limited. I mean, this also was a sign of the time. But communication was still largely by letter. It was largely by telegram. And I fired off a telegram to my uncle in Yakutat, who was a clan leader, and said, you know, I just shot myself in the foot and I need to get back in the meeting. Could you please contact the other clan leaders and see if I can represent you in the room? And they did. I still have the wire that I sent. I still have the letter that they sent back saying, of course, you can go back into the meeting and say you represent the 5 clan leaders of Yakutat. Oil had been discovered and was in modest production on the Kenai. Colorado Oil and Gas, for example, when it left Yakutat, went up onto the North Slope to an area called Coldfoot and was actively exploring there. We in Yakutat knew about that because over the number of years that Colorado Oil and Gas had been in Yakutat, of course, friendships and acquaintances happen, and so there was contact between the North Slope of Alaska and local folks in Yakutat. And again, that was somewhat unique because of the circumstance, because a lot of what was happening on the North Slope was generally known, but not in any kind of detail. And of course, it was, I think, in 1967 that ARCO, I'm not even sure it was ARCO then, I guess it was, and Humboldt announced the discovery well at Prudhoe Bay. And that just erupted into this incredible event in Alaska because it was soon, other wells were drilled around it, and by 1968 it was known that Alaska, on state-selected lands, was owner of the largest oil discovery outside of Saudi Arabia at the time. Everything changed in Alaska in 1968. Everything changed. We had been a very small government. We'd been a very small state. I think the state budget in 1968, 66 was 1968 was less than $200 million. And I don't know whether that's counting federal funds or not, but it was very small. The state held its first oil first sale of oil rights in Alaska in 1969 and achieved $900 million, more than the entire state had spent since statehood. And it was clear to everyone that that was just the tip of the iceberg, or the very tip of the oil well. I have to get this metaphor straight. The first drop of what was going to become, through a pipe at least, a river of oil that would run for decades.